Help capture the history of our markets by contributing to the John Lothian News GoFundMe campaign to support the Markets Wiki Education history-focused video series and more.
The rise of financial futures in Chicago was noticed by traders all over the world. One group in London were so interested, they traveled to the US to learn more. This is where they would get the idea for a new British exchange they would name LIFFE.
I worked in the money markets and started trading treasury bills. And they were the only things you could trade then, and you could only trade them through Chicago.
Chicago, in the period sort of 75 to 80, actually attracted a lot of people. The CME had introduced currency contracts, and then the CBOT, the T-bill and the T-bond. I must say, probably most people were fairly sceptical about whether it had any relevance to London. But one person that wasn't was John Barkshire.
We began to find that the Chicago futures markets were impacting on the cash markets. And so I went to the United States and spent about a couple of months there shuttling between New York and Chicago. And the conclusion I came to was that we, Mercantile House, should become involved in the futures markets because they were the markets of the future. I thought that we should press for there to be a market in London so that our cash business in London would also have the benefit of a futures market. From the stock exchange, from the discount market, from the commodity markets, all having a look at it. And they were all coming back and saying, it's probably quite a good idea, why don't we have a market in London? But the stock exchange, for example, said it should be based on the stock exchange. The commodity market said it should be based on the commodity markets. Whereas, in my view, if it was going to be successful, it needed to have a blend of all of those markets because each of those markets would bring a skill, a client base, and a different ability to trade different contracts.
It was really John's initiative that got LIFFE going. He did two things, really. First of all, he conscripted a group of like-minded people to help him as a working party.
And there were these two slightly separate groups, but we all knew each other. And I do remember sitting down, I think in the end of Lombard Street, John suggesting we should put this together. We tried to rewrite the American script, albeit written by an Englishman in Chicago, for why we should have a market here. And Robert Miller came on board to do that. And it was a rather more serious work, something that could be presented to the Bank of England without looking too American. But in it, I thought the most amusing bit of the whole lot was a reference to horse racing. I thought, my God, this is the end of this serious work to persuade the Bank of England. But it made the very fair point that horse racing really wouldn't be around unless people were able to bet on horses, so that was the only way then that they would be involved in how good the horse was.
And secondly, I think he managed the Bank of England extremely well, bearing in mind that the bank would have to give permission in the end for the market to start.
So I went to see Douglas Dawkins at the Bank of England to say to him that I was hoping to put together a collection of people to take this idea forward, unless, Douglas, you really felt that this was something which we should not pursue. He talked to Eddie George, who was the executive director for the markets at that time, and came back and said, yes, by all means, do what you suggested and keep us informed.
It was exciting because one was being pretty radical in a city that was very conservative but was looking for change and realized it had to change.
LIFFE now had an idea. The next step was to figure out how it was going to clear trades coming through its exchange. There was talks of using the Chicago model and clearing its own trades, but this could have held up the creation of the exchange by up to 2 years. The Bank of England, taking a risk on financial futures, wanted LIFFE to clear through the established ICCH.
We didn't have much choice, to be frank. I mean, the bank, I think mindful of the size of the task, said, well, we think you ought to use an existing clearinghouse.
ICCH at that time was owned by the Trustee Savings Bank. They didn't see that as particularly the right ownership. And the Bank of England were brought in and kind of strong-armed a consortium of high street banks to own the organisation.
We did get a semi-independent clearinghouse backed by our major banks.
ICCH were bringing on board clearing services for a number of other markets at the same time. Lund Gold Futures Market, the International Petroleum Exchange, the Baltic Futures Exchange. There was quite a rush of new markets emerging in London at the time.
Giving credit to ICCH, I mean, they were the people that sponsored a feasibility study, but they really regarded us as a sort of add-on.
Thinking and the technology was maybe too veering towards the commodity markets. And so there emerged some tensions as a result of that.
What we did not anticipate was that, of course, the clearing banks, having bought the organisation, wanted a return. And they needed a return on their capital. And that was at direct odds to us getting the cheapest possible clearing with the lowest possible fees.
When the market opened, it did so with a round-trip fee of 90 pence, 45 pence each side, of which the clearinghouse took 37.5p per side. Now that in itself was a cause of some tension over a number of years.
LIFFE had convinced the Bank of England to accept financial futures trading, but the real question was, could they get anyone to trade on the new exchange?
Intellectually, it's a no-brainer. Why not treat money as a commodity? Practically, of course, quite different, because the banks regarded money as theirs, and the price of money as theirs, and that was the problem. The jobbers in the stock market, one jobber went one way, one went another way. The foreign exchange market understood it completely. After all, that's what they did. They operated a forward market in foreign exchange. They understood it, but saw no reason to have it, because they weren't thinking about the bond markets and later the equity markets.
We held a series of seminars, public seminars, and we intended to hold 4, and in the end we had to hold 6, because such was the demand for people to come to them. We also gave individual presentations to the clearing banks as a whole, the discount market, the stock exchange, and others. So all of the different groups had their own presentation. I think that consultation process, and very detailed consultation process, was in a way the single fact which led to the successful start of LIFFE.
The first market in London that was open to all, whether it was banks, stockbrokers, commodity traders, or individuals. To that extent, LIFFE was entirely new.
We got the spread of membership to begin with, which was good because it showed broad-based support for the market. And what then evolved was the right mix of members, which was different. But of course, one must remember that the city itself was changing at that time, and the discount market was in the process of disappearing as such. The stock exchange was in the process of disappearing as in its single capacity. And as the barriers came down, the city changed. And in a way, LIFFE reflected that change in our change of membership.
An awful lot of the people in the city felt, well, let's see. And there was a classic lunch one day, and I was up in the stock exchange with the then chief executive and looking down, and he told me, as he looked down the Royal Exchange, he had said to the then chairman, Nicholas Goodison, look, that thing's working quite well. Nicholas apparently said to him, but maybe we should have had that. And the reply came back, yeah, but we wouldn't have made it work. Yes. And there was a feeling that some of its vitality came from it being the new city, not the old city.
The next steps LIFFE took helped it reach its peak of success, but almost caused them to close doors just years later.
The big change, I think, in our contracts, or the obvious change, was that they went from being almost entirely domestic-based to start with, to being almost entirely international, with the great success of the Bund contract and others over a period of years. So in a way, that reinforced the role of London as an international financial centre.
I think all German banks wanted a hedging instrument. And eventually the Germans recognised that and were going to set up, or did set up, a market that subsequently became DTB. But that needed legislation, which always takes time. And therefore, we and our members, German members, wanted us to introduce the Bund. The German government, as one might expect, sort of said, well, can't you wait until we start our own? Which was probably a couple of years away. We had some support from a member of the Bundesbank who basically said, yes, we'd like to do it in Germany, but we can't, but we need a hedging instrument, and therefore London, go ahead. The German Ministry of Finance wasn't quite so forthcoming. They said, we'd rather would you wait until we started? We were worried about whether this might be a diplomatic incident, but the Bank of England said, no, if you go ahead, it'll be fine. And it's quite interesting because the Matif in France wanted to do a Bund contract, but the French government were worried that it might destabilize Franco-German relations, so they never went ahead.
This program is brought to you by John Lothian Productions, your go-to video production company in the financial industry. Eventually, Eurex, a combination of the Swiss exchange Soffex and the German exchange DTB, would fight to get the Bund back from life.
At that time, we had 3 major exchanges in Switzerland, Zurich, Geneva and Basel, and an association of these exchanges in combination with the major banks. The Bürgenstock conference that they established that they would like to go for options. As it turned out, they took studies, they traveled around the world, went to Chicago, to OCC and CBOE, and in 1985 actually then they commissioned Anderson Consulting at that time to come up with a project which really was actually the vision and the revolutionary thing to start an IT project and going for a trading platform integrated with clearing. We were actually happy when we had a response time of about 2 seconds for a trade, which at that time was really fast when you look at the floor trading where you had the runners and the telephones and actually still auction trading at that time. Immediately after we started out, the discussion began with DTB. And I think one of the big achievements was really that we could sell a license of the system to the new, we founded DTB.
It was 13 million Deutschmark we paid for the system to the Swiss. From our point of view, from the point of view from nowadays, it was extremely expensive. However, in those days there was no experience. There was no real alternative. This was an integrated system, clearing and trading on one platform. From our point of view, for the very beginning, it was a big success. It was a big benefit for everybody. One of the reasons to implement an electronic trading system and not going as live, for example, to a floor, was to combine these exchanges with the exchange in Frankfurt. And this was a success after a while, and so there was no opponents from the regional stock exchange side. Should we start with the Bund Future, already very successfully installed on the LIFFE in London? Or should we start with the equity options? We decided, and this was a good thing, to start with the equity options. Then to start with the product, which was very successfully traded on another exchange, is definitely very difficult. It was a success. Then we thought an option on index should be fine. It was a success too. And then we looked to the future market. And this was an advantage of our exchange, including both the option market and the future market.
DTB, being an all-electronic exchange, decided there was no reason traders outside of Germany couldn't trade on their exchange, so it began working to make this a reality.
We thought if an exchange like ours, with an electronic trading system, is able to combine the German community. So you can trade from Hamburg, for example, directly with exchange via the system, via the electronic connection. Why not doing this with other European countries? What we definitely underestimated was the reaction of the officials in the other countries. We started with the Netherlands. We had these discussions with the finance minister over there. It was unbelievable, inflexible. By the end of 1995, the new EU directive arrived and became effective. And this new directive forced the electronic trading exchanges to combine potential market members from other countries.
Now that the DTB was a success, it focused on capturing the Bund from life. Being a hedging exchange for German banks, it believed it should be the main exchange trading the Bund, not LIFFE.
When we started in the late 1990 with the Bund Future, we get a market share of 5%, 10%, later on 15%. for a year. Nothing happened. And they blamed me, said, why don't you do more to get the bond future back, they said. It was not back because it was never here. A year after we started, the bank community sat together, including some British banks, by the way, or British brokers, said, what can we do here in Frankfurt to get market share from LIFFE? And they decided to do it, in quotation mark, artificially. So they did. And suddenly, from one day or from 1 week to another one, we got a market share of 40%. The Bank of England intervened and spoke to the finance ministry in Berlin, saying, what's going on with DTB, with the bond future? This is not normal. So the finance ministry phoned with me and said, well, Mr. Franke, what's going on? They said, I have no idea. I'm not the trader in the market. This is obviously a new situation in the market. Nobody trusted us. This was clear. And let's say after half a year, everything stopped. And we fall down back, not to 10 or 15%, but 20, 25%.
While DTB was trying to capture more of the Bund future, it started talks with Soffex to combine the two exchanges.
Obviously, there has been slight differences in regards of functionality, in regards of processing, both in the trading and clearing between the systems. And yeah, it was quite an effort after about 10 years operation at Soffex and about 8 years operation at DTB to bring this system together. What we achieved over 1 week in the release installation there actually is combining two markets. All the contracts actually, we traded actually until end of day Friday at Soffex and DTB. And over weekend we brought the two trading systems together and had all the contracts and all the markets in one system. But what hasn't been actually realized in this world is that over this same weekend we put together two clearing houses. So all the collaterals, all the positions, all the guarantees, everything was put together over this weekend as well and was Monday morning under the name of Eurex available to the clients out of the old Soffex and the old DTB.
DTB, transitioning to become Eurex, decided to look at the Bund differently.
We thought it might be a good idea to look to the costs. And we asked some market members who were trading at LIFFE and at DTB. And some say, well, we need 10 times more people being at the floor of LIFFE than trading with DTB electronically to trade the same traded volume. Try to trade it here. It's by far cheaper. And if you've got the same success in getting the volume you would like to trade, then after a while you see it's cheaper. We had the first official press conference and so forth. And I was asked, now you have nearly 50%, when will you have 100%? He said, 100%, far away. Maybe we get 80, maybe we get 60 or 70, but not 100. And half a year later, we had 100.
I felt, and I remember saying so one time, that I felt that, the days of open outcry were numbered. I thought they would probably go on for another 5 to 10 years, but I certainly thought they would eventually go. It's probably a bit of hindsight, but I think we perhaps could have done more, but politically it was very difficult because the board really didn't want to countenance the idea that open outcry might actually disappear. So I think the problem with all organisations is that as they become established, they become resistant to change. LIFFE was fortunate insofar as when we set it up, we had no baggage to bring with it. And we did change tremendously over the initial years. But by the time we're talking about 1990, it's become a sort of institution with particular groups that feel strongly. And it becomes more difficult to change. I mean, I think that's a problem that exchanges have got now.
I think the biggest single failure of all that we set up was not understanding where technology was going and not understanding that open outcry had a limited future and that the world of electronics and electronic trading would overtake us. And I think we were a long way behind in our thought process. I think partly because we were seduced by the buzz in Chicago and the buzz that was then created in LIFFE on the floor, that we thought that we'd got the ultimate solution, and in fact the ultimate solution was quite different and was based on electronic trading.
The huge transition of the Bund from LIFFE to Eurex sent shockwaves through the financial world. There was now a real-life example of how more efficient electronic trading could be than open outcry. Exchanges around the globe knew that change was coming, and they would either need to jump on or be left behind. Eurex and the Bund had changed trading forever.
John Lothian News would like to thank those individuals who have contributed to our Markets Wiki Education GoFundMe campaign. Their financial assistance allows us to produce and distribute videos like this for our Open Outcry Traders History Project or the Path to Electronic Trading video series. Join them in supporting John Lothian News, capturing the history of our industry.